Well, John, it's really a delight to be here with you today. I've been looking forward to this, and I wasn't anxious about it until I sent out an email to about 3 dozen colleagues of ours and learned about what they thought of you. And you should know that there's no one, I don't think, who's more highly thought of in the field of individual differences and group differences than you. And people see you as having a lot of wisdom. So it was really humbling to listen to all of what they had to say about you. And we also use your structural equation modeling book at Vanderbilt as a text. So that was nice too.
This is supposed to put me at my ease, I suppose.
Put you in your ease, no performance anxiety. How did you get started in this?
Well, I started out with some genes and added a little environment. And various things happened to me along the way, and here I am.
And
okay, we're finished now. Questions?
I'm gonna probe for a little more content here. You started out in India?
That's right. My parents were missionaries, and I assumed that everybody grew up the same way I did, just as all you folks make this assumption. But that really wasn't true, as I found out later on. But it gave me something of a different perspective on things, I think, and may have made me a little more independent in my thinking in some ways, because I was changing subcultures, so to speak.
And where did you do your undergraduate work?
I did my undergraduate work at 3 different colleges. I came back to the States after high school from mission school in India, and went as a freshman to the College of Worcester in Ohio, which was just down the road from Akron, where my aunt and uncle were living that I was staying with. And this was during World War II, and I became 18, and I became liable to the draft. So I decided I would enlist in the Navy and at least have food and shelter at all times. So I went into an officer's training program, which sent me to another small Ohio college, Baldwin Wallace, near Cleveland. And after about a year there, the Navy decided to shut it down and sent half of us to some small college in Kentucky and half of us to Harvard. And I was fortunately in the latter half. So I finished up my undergraduate work at Harvard about a year until the war ended, and I got out of uniform, and then another year to finish up.
And you earned a degree in?
English.
English?
Yeah.
So how did that translate into psychology?
Well, it had to translate into English first. That is, I started out as a freshman thinking I would be a chemist. In my sophomore year, I thought I would go in for mathematics. When I got to Harvard, I found that I couldn't meet the requirements for the math major in a couple of years because they had interlocking requirements and so on. Mm-hmm. And I could meet the requirements for the English degree in a couple of years, and I thought English was pretty interesting. You had to read the books you wanted to read anyway, and so I became an English major. Got over that by about a year in advertising, and decided I'd go on in graduate school doing something else. And I'd had a couple of psychology courses along the way, and I thought that would be kind of interesting. So I applied a few places, and Berkeley let me in, and so I went through that.
Who did you work with there?
I worked with Richard Crutchfield, a Gestalt social psychologist, because when I started out there, I thought I'd be a social psychologist. But I changed my mind there too, and wound up working at the Institute of Personality Assessment and Research, and McKinnon was technically my dissertation advisor because Crutchfield was off for a year in Denmark or somewhere.
Mm-hmm.
And so I finished up there and got a job at the University of Nebraska, teaching a course in personality because it was a last-minute hire because their person in that job had got a better offer somewhere and gone away and
Mm-hmm.
abandoned them.
Mm-hmm.
So I got hired there and got interested in the genetics of personality in the course of putting notes together to teach this course. And so I pursued that. And during the time I was at Nebraska, they got their first computer, and that sounded like fun too, so I got interested in that. So for a while I maintained a dual affiliation to computers and to personality, the genetics of personality.
Mm-hmm.
And I'd say both of them have continued, but I've maintained the interest in the behavior genetics has become more central in individual differences.
Mm-hmm. And then when did the move to Texas occur?
That occurred when I'd been at Nebraska about 6 years, and I was in a non-tenure track position, so I was looking for jobs elsewhere. And I had an offer. I had been to a summer institute run by Newell and Simon on computer modeling.
Mm.
And so I was brought down to replace somebody who did this for a year while he was off at Stanford. And Stanford decided to keep him, so they decided to keep me. And at that time, Gardner Lindsay had come as chairman, and I had met him in connection with the behavior genetics side of things. So it really worked out very nicely.
And what year was that about?
64 was the year I went there as on a visiting appointment, and then at 65 I joined the faculty permanently.
Okay. And then about 10 years after that, you published that famous book on heredity, environment, and personality. How did all that research start?
Steve Vandenberg was partly responsible. I got to know him and borrowed some data from him and stuff like that. And he had a conference at Louisville, which he invited me to.
Mm-hmm.
And Bob Nichols was also invited there from National Merit Scholarship Foundation. And he had a huge amount of data on twins. And I had some ideas which we discussed about analyzing this. So he invited me up to the National Merit place in Evanston for a summer as on a visiting basis. And we got to work on that stuff, and that wound up as being the Heredity, Environment, and Personality book.
Interesting. What do you consider the major findings to come out of that line of research?
Well, I think the most important, finding, it wasn't completely novel, but we did make a point of it, was the influence of shared environment being so small.
Mm-hmm.
That really was a surprise given what other psychologists were saying at the time.
Yeah. And then in the same interval, you started work. I believe it was in 1971 when you started work on that famous book, came out in 75, on race differences in intelligence, with Gardner Lindsay and an anthropologist.
Yeah.
How did that start?
Well, Gardner came to my office one day and said, "How would you like to take a year off and work on race differences?"
Really?
And I said, "I'd love to." He and Jim Spuler had written a chapter on I think it was race differences in behavior, but anyway, on the topic before. And so Gardner had thought, well, we'll take some time off and pull together a broader summary.
Mm-hmm.
And so he, I guess, recruited Jim. And then he thought, well, there'll need to be some statistical stuff, and since I was teaching undergraduate statistics at the time, they figured I could do it.
Mm-hmm.
And so Gardner said, come along, and I came along, and we had a good time working on the basics of the book, and then these are two other busy guys, so they let me do most of the pulling together of the final version.
Mm-hmm. And it took about 4 years.
I suppose that's what, 71, 72, I think, was the year we were out there, and the book came out in 75, 76.
Mm-hmm. Did you consider the topic controversial at the time? Was it considered controversial?
Oh, it was considered controversial, all right. And from the beginning, Gardner was very concerned with consulting people from various backgrounds and with different perspectives and so on. So there was a lot of machinery of that kind, inviting guests in for brief visits to the center to discuss the topic with us.
Mm-hmm.
So we were conscious of the controversy from the start. I mean, Gardner was more conscious than I was because
Mm-hmm.
I was naive about all of this stuff, but
Mm-hmm.
it was very much a focus of our concerns.
How smooth was the process of getting that book off to market? Were there controversies within the group of authors, or disagreements?
I don't think so. We often work considerably independently on different topics or different sections,
Mm-hmm.
And we talk about them, and we bring, there were some discussions and seminars at the center, so we got a variety of different points of view, but I don't remember that we had any real difficulties in the writing of the book.
Mm-hmm. Was there anything in the book that you would have changed in retrospect?
You mean if I knew as much as I know now?
If you knew as much as you know now.
Not as much as I wish I could.
I see.
Could have said. That is a good deal of what, I mean, in preparation for this, I went and looked through it, sections of it, not that I didn't
Right.
quite read it cover to cover. But I was surprised how up-to-date a lot of it is, which is a real shame because we ought to know something more than we did 30 years ago.
But there hasn't been that much.
There's been some development. I mean, I won't say there's been no development. There's been some interesting developments.
Mm-hmm.
But a lot of the kinds of research we propose that should address these questions hasn't really been carried out on the scale it would need to be carried out.
Mm-hmm.
Race mixture studies, which are very powerful, theoretically a very powerful approach, haven't really materialized in the psychological field. There's been some of it in the medical field, I think, but
Mm-hmm. What do you think are the most important studies that need to be done given our current knowledge in this area?
Well, I took the words right out of my mouth. Race mixture.
Race mixture.
That is both in the in a simple sense, but we're much advanced now in the ability to identify genetic origins,
Mm-hmm.
and to estimate the proportion of genes for a given individual that come from different gene pools. That really has made very large progress in the years since the time we were writing about it. And so studies of this kind should be perfectly feasible, and but they're politically very difficult, and for some of the reasons Linda was talking about this morning.
Right.
Bright young investigators are very nervous about getting involved with them because you could put in several years of work and then have it blow up in your face politically.
Right.
And senior people like myself get lazy. and don't, well, I'll speak just for myself. Some of my other senior colleagues seem willing to take on huge projects. But it's a big commitment of effort. There's a great deal of difficulty getting this sort of thing funded. There was back then, and it's even more so, I believe, the case now. Mm-hmm. That you say, well, I want to make a great big study of ancestry and intelligence. You're going to have some difficulty. I mean, you might find some private foundations to fund it, but you aren't going to get government funding.
Right. That's how you would have to do it, probably. What were your impressions of the exchange last summer in Psychology, Public Policy, and Law with the Rushton and Jensen Target article and commentaries and rejoinders?
Well, I guess my immediate reaction was there's still a lot of things that haven't been settled.
Right.
Many of which could have been settled by now if people had tackled them energetically. Mm-hmm. And it seems to be sort of embarrassing to us as a society to have important questions, important social issues, with a great deal of financial investment, emotional investment, and so on, and something like black-white differences in average IQ.
Right.
And yet nobody seems to want to find out what the facts are, mm-hmm. which should make it much easier to do whatever you want to do politically. If I wanted to have blacks, whites, and Asians all equal in IQ, I would think the first thing I'd want to know is why are they different? Mm-hmm. Because only if you know why they're different can you formulate some reasonable strategy for making them the same. But nobody seems to want to know why they're different.
Right.
Even though they say they want to make them all the same.
Mm-hmm. Any advice to young investigators who want to pursue this?
Yeah, do what you think would be interesting, and tackle problems that you think would be important, even if it's not obvious that you can get financial support and easy promotions and so on. You're probably going to have be paying some taxes, to take Linda's phrase this morning. But if you're doing things that interest you, you don't have to worry too much about whether or not you get promoted this year or next year. Mm-hmm. If your colleagues see you as a sincere scientist trying to answer important problems, they're going to respect you. Personally, I haven't had any flack that I know about. What people say behind my back, I couldn't say. Mm-hmm. But generally, I've not had academic problems. I got my promotions. They had me chairman of the department for a while, this mm-hmm. kind of thing. Not a problem. Mm-hmm. Then I didn't run into any major blow-ups with the press or any of those other things that mm-hmm. Can happen pretty unpredictably.
You're one of the few people who work in both methods and substance in this area. And do you see biometrically informed designs helping us understand psychology at all? Do they tell us anything about the substantive significance of psychological traits, their nature?
They could. I don't guarantee that they will. Mm-hmm. But in principle, if you can show that these things hang together and they're different from those things, and nobody had noticed this before, yeah.
Have there been any examples of that that come to mind?
Nothing really striking.
Mm-hmm.
It could be, but I won't say that it has been. But on the other hand, you can say that psychometric methods have done as well as anything else.
Mm-hmm.
And they've certainly, the major applied contribution of psychology is the intelligence test.
Yeah. Yeah. John, what do you see as your biggest contribution to psychology?
Oh, I guess I'd have to plead the fifth on that one.
What are you proudest of?
Well, the book that's warmest to my heart is the Heredity, Environment, Personality book.
Mm-hmm.
You know, because it was the first thing I did in this area, and it was easy. It was easy because Bob Nichols had already done all the hard work, and it was fun to write, and so I have a soft spot in my heart for it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. What would you say your biggest professional regret?
Oh, I don't know. No Nobel Prize and no prospects of one. I don't have any really serious professional regrets. I think that the academic world has treated me very decently, and I enjoy keeping my hand in.
Mm-hmm. When you started out as a young academic, did you have heroes or role models that you?
Not as such. I mean, I've never really felt myself modeling myself on people I associated with.
Mm-hmm.
There were people who were important to my development.
Mm-hmm.
That is, Steve Vandenberg, for example, was quite instrumental in getting me going in behavior genetics. Ray Cattell was someone that he offered me a job just before I got the offer from Nebraska.
Really?
Since his was a postdoc and Nebraska was a real job, even if non-tenure track.
Mm-hmm.
I took the Nebraska job. But I always admired Ray. I didn't believe him all the time,
Mm-hmm.
but he was certainly a very smart man and a model of skill at spinning out theories, let me put it that way. So, I admired him. Gardner Lindsay was important first in hiring me at Texas, and second in getting me started on this race differences business. If I was really a fan of anybody, it was Richard Crutchfield that I worked with, but he had no direct influence on the rest of of my life. I'm not a Gestalt social psychologist by any stretch of the imagination, but he was an interesting. Well, I mean, I really did admire him, and I really did like him, and I'm sure he shaped my thinking in a number of ways.
Mm-hmm. When people think of race differences in intelligence, they think of Art Jensen comes to mind, and when experts in the area think of race differences in intelligence. Art Jensen comes to mind, but you do too with as much frequency. And people want to always know what you think.
Well, first on the topic of Art Jensen,
Yeah.
I am a great admirer of Art's, and he has one thing to commend him that I certainly don't have, namely that he got out there and did a great deal of empirical work along very interesting lines. That is, looking at reaction times was a real inspiration, and so I greatly admire him for it.
Do your views differ in any fundamental way on the important topics in the area?
Oh, I'm sure they differ in 1,000 ways, but I guess, yeah, I've not been the G enthusiast that Art has been, although I'm an admirer of G, but I still think, as I have generally, and has been reinforced here, there are always different ways of looking at it.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, in the last hour we learned a different way of looking at G.
Right. Right.
I mean, and I think the distinction between G as a psychometric phenomenon, which it certainly is, although there are always alternative psychometric formulations, is a distinction between that and G as a biological phenomenon, which could be explained in various ways, but it might turn out to be a genetic G, in which case it would be something we could find out more about, and we could settle some of these issues.
Mm-hmm. If you were given $25 million to allocate for research in individual or group differences, how would you spend it?
Well, I'd spend a little bit of it at the beginning telling people that I'd got this
Uh-huh.
and to send me ideas. And then I'd pick out 2 or 3 that sounded to me most interesting, both from the standpoint of it being a person with interesting ideas, whether or not I thought they would pan out or not, but somebody who looked like they would follow up on them.
Mm-hmm.
And then, well, I guess that'd be the main thing. Do the suggestions give promise of getting us ahead?
Mm-hmm. What do you think are the most important things in graduate training for students to get?
Well, the most important thing is to learn how to enjoy it. That is, some graduate students really don't seem to enjoy what they're doing,
Mm-hmm.
and that's a shame.
Yeah.
They should either change their field or go and become happy house husbands or something.
Uh-huh.
But as long as you enjoy what you're doing, you can, you're going to get along all right because you're enjoying what you're doing. As long as you're doing something that is painful to you in the hopes that eventually you'll get to do something you like to do, that's not a very promising
Mm-hmm.
avenue.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I certainly wouldn't recommend my career path to young graduate students. It's probably a serious mistake to go off in a different tangent every time you find something that interests you, because if you're have moderately broad interests, that's going to happen all the time,
Mm-hmm.
and you won't spend enough time on any one thing to make much progress. But a certain amount of that will let you find your way to what you really want to do, and you can count on old age in pruning off some of the branches of your interest as you go along.
Okay, well, John, I think at this point we have a audience eager to ask you some questions. So I'm going to stop monopolizing the time and turn it over to them and ask for questions from the audience.
Fine.
Hi, I'm Frank Mealy. If I were writing a book, general psychology for the intelligent reader, not a psychology 101 textbook, but for the average reader out there in the public, based upon what's been learned by your own studies and in the field generally over the course of your career, what would be the 3 most important things you would want to tell that person, or concepts to get across to them?
Ooh, 3? Well, one thing I'd want to make sure that they appreciated was the importance of individual differences. That is, seems to be abroad in the land a view that people don't vary very much, unless you're talking about your own relatives, in which case you see huge differences. And I think there's a tendency in the general perception of to minimize the amount of variation there is among individuals. The matter of the relationship between individual differences and group differences is badly misunderstood by the public. That is, they tend to stereotype, to think that people in any category other than themselves are very much alike, when that's nearly always empirically false. I'll let that count as 2. And I'll count as 3 that he should try to make people appreciate the fact that the psychological and the biological are pretty strongly related, and that a lot of what's going to be happening in the next decade or 2 is going to be in the form of links between those 2 domains, and so that people should be expecting this to be happening.
My name is Doug Detterman. First of all, I'd just like to say I've really enjoyed your career from a distance, what you've written, and it's really had an influence on me and I think many of my students. Your book on race differences had an even-handed tone to it, and I wonder how you accomplished that. We can see by your temperament why it's that way, but did you do anything special to really accomplish that? Did you work at it, or did it just come out that way?
Somewhere between that. We certainly were conscious, as I mentioned earlier, from the very beginning, that this was a controversial topic on which people had different opinions, and so we consulted widely and discovered quite a few things that we hadn't appreciated about the perspectives of other racial groups on some of these issues, for instance. Then we thought, since it's a somewhat controversial topic, we ought to try to give a balanced presentation and not to be real mean or nasty to anybody. And so we tried to do that, and I guess we succeeded.
Doug Detterman again, second question. Why do you think this area is so controversial? What is it about this area that really makes it so controversial and arouses people's emotions to the extent it does?
Well, I think the phrase, all men are created equal, has done a lot of mischief as well as had a very beneficial effect. That is, there's a contrast, which is not, of course, within this association or within science or within psychology or within science, but a major philosophical and historical conflict between the individual and the state and so on. And so when you talk about race differences or even individual differences, when you start dealing with the educational implications of them, you get into a lot of problems with people that, well, if everybody's created equal, why aren't they equal? Well, you know, you've heard those discussions.
Richard Lynn, you told us that your parents were missionaries, so I imagine that when you were a child, you adopted their faith, as children nearly always do. I'd like to ask how your religious commitments have changed, or perhaps not changed, over the years.
Oh, that's an actually, I guess I would say that while as a kid, I obviously went to church and Sunday school and so forth. I was and enjoyed discussing theological issues with my friends, who were also children of missionaries for the most part. But I never took more than or for the most part, I didn't take more than an intellectual interest in these exercises. And so I didn't really keep up the going to church and so on. But I didn't really have any dramatic breaks on the matter. I just got interested in doing other things.
Tom Bouchard, this is kind of a question for me. We both have our degrees from Berkeley, and I've often wondered, you know, would I have done the same sorts of things if I'd have gone somewhere else? And I notice you've sort of wandered around the countryside, and I've wandered around the countryside, and I wonder if we got that from there or somewhere else. I can't. Of course, I can't answer my question for either for you or for me. But I will say your
that
opinion will do fine.
that Berkeley was an interesting place intellectually when I was there, and I assume still was when you were there. There were a lot of ideas going around, and a lot of the faculty were, well, they had a lot of fights among themselves, but there were a bunch of mavericks in the group, and that made it kind of fun to be around.
Yeah, that's my opinion too. I want to make a comment following Doug. I just taught my lecture on race differences on Tuesday, last lecture in my course, and I drew a whole bunch of material from your book, and I think it's all still relevant. And I think one point to make is that book had a very, very broad perspective, and there's considerable discussion about race differences right now, and it's all so narrow. Doesn't have the perspective. That book is really a classic, and you really ought to be congratulated for doing such a fine job.
Well, thank you.
Linda Gottfredson. I have a question about race, but not about race differences. In looking at the literature recently, actually reading a review that Tim Bates and Ian Deary and Frank Spineth did on the genetics of intelligence, they reported a lot of advances in our understanding. And the question I had is, do we have that understanding for anything other than whites at the present time? For example, heritabilities, or any of the basic information that we have about the genetics, the course of development, influences of genes on change and stability. Do we have any studies since the 60s or 70s, just among blacks, on basic questions?
Well, I'm sure 20 people in this room are better qualified to answer that question than I am, because I haven't really kept up on the recent developments on race. But in answer to your question, no, I don't think there's been any rush to do studies on cognitive development in different races, and for some of the reasons that we've discussed. Nobody wants to admit that they might be different.
Well, the question I have is whether they're the same in terms of developmental, terms of what we find out about heritabilities or so on.
Mm-hmm.
So not mean differences,
Yeah.
but
No,
surprising.
but nobody wants to admit that the processes might be different
Yeah.
either.
Or
And
that they're
that's
even
and that would be the reason for doing a separate study in blacks and whites of early cognitive development, say, would be to see if there were any differences. And there might not be, but nobody seems to want to find out.
And just last question, do you get tired of getting questions on race?
I don't get that many questions on race until I come to a place like this. Yeah, that is, most of my activity in recent years has not been concerned with race, and so I don't get that many questions.
My name's Tim Bates. I wonder if you would comment or give your views on what you think the role of the environment is, and maybe especially as informed by what we know about the genetics of intelligence. I'm thinking of, I remember Paul Meehl, when he was looking at schizotypy, was saying that this was a trait that would develop in all existing environments. In other words, you could imagine an environment that was so bad that you wouldn't be able to express, or that it would cause some perturbation. But do humans have some sort of minimal cultural or other kind of environment within which they'll all develop to a level that's quite genetically fixed? Or is there a lot of variance in the environment so that we could potentially raise ability a lot by altering those environments? Or how sensitive are we to our environment?
Certainly at the extremes, extremely bad environments. You can think of plenty of environments like being in front of a speeding truck that won't do your IQ any good. But it is obviously and certain and unambiguously the case that you got to have both genes and an environment in order to exist at all. And the interesting questions concern the relative contributions, or one interesting question concerns the relative contributions of the two in particular cases, in accounting for differences in outcomes. You can offer as a general principle that, you can assign some role to genes and environments to differences between individuals on anything you care to mention. But that still doesn't mean that you are understanding what's going on, because you don't understand which genes are involved how in development, or which environments are making a difference. Just saying that under present conditions, individual differences among U.S. whites are 75% genetic. That's an interesting fact from which to proceed, but it isn't the end of any interesting understanding of what's going on.
Maybe as a little follow-up, in terms of things that people may have discovered or think they've discovered since your seminal work. I guess one of the things that would be on people's minds would be things like the effect that Eric Turkheimer reported, and I think that you might have even been involved in replicating in another sample, indicating that heritability was high as long as you were, let's say middle class or better, but that as we went down into very low SES groups that are often underrepresented, that heritability there was lower. And I guess that for a lot of people who would never come to a meeting like this, their view would be that's really that's the big picture.
Yeah. Well, it's a very interesting big picture, and it is correct that Eric and I and a student of his, I should put them in the opposite order, a student of his and Eric and I are coming out with an article which replicates the increase in heritability with increase in socioeconomic status. But the interesting thing, or an interesting thing about it, is that he did his original study with the collaborative study, at which the top end, the high heritability end, was about the same level of socioeconomic status as the low end of our study. And so, which was the National Merit Twins. And so you have a curious anomaly of going up like that, going up like that, if you take them literally. But obviously what needs to be done is to have a single population that goes across the whole range and then do the study there and see what you find, whether you find discontinuities, which I doubt, or whether you find something like an increase that levels off, which would seem fairly plausible, or what. But yeah, it looks like heritability varies with socioeconomic status, but we sure don't understand why.
Thank you.
Just to follow up on that, this is Linda Gottfredson. What were the ages? Because at the early ages, Turkheimer's first study was very young ages.
That's right.
But what happens?
His study was, I think, with the 7-year-olds,
Right.
and our study was with juniors in high school. And so there's a big gap there, and it would be nice to have a population that varied not only in socioeconomic status, but varied in age. Absolutely.
Because I was thinking that if heritability goes up with age, it just may go up sooner with higher social class kids, in a way, and lower social class kids, when they start going into more adolescent and adult environments, then their heritabilities will go up too. So there's an age confound.
Yeah, there's an age confound, but it doesn't really help us here immediately, because the Turkheimer study has the association with SES independent of age, since they're all 7-year-olds. And our study has SES independent of age because they're all 16-year-olds. But it could be that the ball game is different at age 7 and at age 16, which I guess is the point you're making. And if so, we'll find out if we have a population that varies in age and SES over the relevant range.
Can I ask a question from here?
Sure. That's Art Jensen in case.
What is your present opinion of the status of the Flynn effect?
The question was, what was my opinion of the current status of the Flynn effect? My answer is, it seems to be arousing a lot of interest. I don't know what has caused the Flynn effect. There are a lot of hypotheses around, some genetic ones as well as some environmental ones. As with all historical kinds of things, you have limited opportunity for replication. You have no way of knowing whether it's going to continue, and if so, how long, and will it level off? You do have some clues with say, Flynn effects in developing countries against Flynn effects in developed countries, and I gather some of that stuff is being done, and I think we're going to hear about some of it in these meetings. But there are lots of unanswered questions. Jim Flynn does seem to be onto something, and exactly what it means, we don't know.
To the microphone. Okay.
99% of the time, I'm Don Templer. 99% of the time, it's referred to as the Flynn effect. Would you think that terminology should be used, or do you think it should be called the Flynn effect?
I've always liked to use one word instead of two when I can, so I still call it the Flynn effect. There is some historical logic for calling it the Flynn effect. It was certainly popularized in psychology by Flynn. His articles were the ones that really called it to people's attention. So in that sense, I don't object to calling it the Flynn effect.
Thank you.
Sam Thiessen. In time, what do you think the effects, the manifest effects of your works will be? More significant, less significant, about the same, or does it matter?
Well, I sure would be I would like to be thought as a historical pioneer who launched developments that have made him completely obsolete. But so far, I don't think it's happened.
We got one more question.
Jason McPherson from Australia. Probably a silly question from Australia. Jason McPherson. I was wondering, you mentioned being a little bit shocked when you found such a small role for shared variants, which leaves the question still about unshared variants. And so my question is, do you think there might be very important aspects of the unshared environment that we'll never be able to measure? And for that matter, do you think there might also be important human individual differences that we might not ever be able to measure?
Well, I'm sure the answer to your question is yes. I mean, the general answer has got to be yes. But I suspect that we will be able to account for a great deal more of the variance than we have so far. Although the case you mentioned, the within family differences, has been a very interesting and challenging one. And the pursuit of this by Robert Plomin and others has been disappointing in its results so far, but that doesn't mean that somebody here doesn't have a paper ready to go out that will solve it all.
I would like to thank John Loehlin for coming today and for his career.
And I would like to thank all of you for inviting me here and for my career, since so many of you have contributed to it.